welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us a really compelling set of sources today.
Yeah, definitely some heavy but crucial material.
We're tackling, I think, one of the core questions for understanding early America. How did the lives, the actual day-to-day experiences of enslaved people differ between the colonial North and the South?
It's essential.
And this deep dive, really, it's about giving you the framework, the main points you'll need for that essay, comparing and contrasting the two.
And the first big point, looking across all these sources from, say, the 1600s through the mid-1700s, is that slavery wasn't just a Southern thing, it was everywhere.
Right, in every single colony. It was baked into the British imperial economy.
Absolutely. The demand for labor, specifically unfree labor, was universal. That's the common starting point.
But, and this is the critical part for your essay, that common starting point branches off immediately. The life of an enslaved person in Boston versus one in Charlestown. Well, they were worlds apart.
Worlds apart. And it almost entirely boils down to the economy, the kinds of work being done.
You mean the labor systems?
Exactly. The North and South developed these radically different economies, and that shaped population density, the laws, family life, everything for enslaved people. Same institution, slavery, but applied very, very differently based on regional needs.
Okay, let's unpack that. And I think we have to start where the system was biggest and harshest, the South. What was driving things there?
Well, it was commercial agriculture, pure and simple. In the Chesapeake colonies, that's Virginia and Maryland, the big moneymaker by the late 1600s was tobacco.
Which is incredibly labor-intensive work, right?
Oh, unbelievably so. Constant attention year-round. Planting, tending, harvesting, curing. It just demanded bodies, lots of them.
And they initially tried indentured servants, but that didn't quite work out for tobacco.
No, not for the long haul. Servants cost money up front, their terms ended, and then, crucially, they often became competitors. The planters needed a permanent, controllable workforce they could expand.
So that leads to...
That desperation leads directly to the legal shift towards chattel slavery. You see laws emerging late in the 17th century that define Africans not as temporary laborers, but as property. Inheritable property, assets, like livestock. Not people in the eyes of the law. That's chattel slavery, and it becomes the absolute bedrock of the Southern economy.
Okay, so Chesapeake is tobacco. Then you have the deep South, particularly South Carolina. What's their cash crop?
Rice. And South Carolina's story is kind of unique. It was settled heavily by planters coming from Barbados.
Barbados, the huge sugar island.
Exactly. So they brought that brutal, highly efficient plantation model with them. They knew how to maximize labor for profit. And they found that rice grew incredibly well in the swampy low country there.
And the sources mentioned something interesting about that rice. It wasn't just for export.
That's a really key point for you to pull out. Yes, some was exported, but a major function of South Carolina rice was actually to feed the enslaved populations across the New World, especially in the Caribbean sugar islands.
So it was strategic, high-calorie fuel for the whole slavery system.
Precisely. It powered the engine. Cheaply grown fuel.
And you really see that reliance in the population numbers. They're just stark. Virginia gets to over 40% enslaved, but South Carolina, the rice colony, it hits nearly 60% enslaved by the mid-1700s.
60%. Think about that.
So when you have that kind of concentration, I mean, a majority enslaved population, what does that do to the society? To controls?
Well, it creates immense fear among the white minority, and that fear guarantees two things. First, this deep institutionalized dehumanization. Second, incredibly harsh legal repression.
It's different even from the Caribbean, right? The sources contrast them.
Yeah, it's a grim comparison. In the West Indies, sugar profits were so astronomical that owners often literally worked people to death in just a few years and simply bought more. It was cheaper. In the American South, conditions were still horrendous, but owners focused more on what's sometimes called generational ownership. They wanted the enslaved population to reproduce itself because replacements were relatively more expensive than in the islands.
That phrase, generational ownership, it's chilling. How did the laws reflect that, especially regarding children?
Very explicitly. The laws were designed to break families apart. Marriage between enslaved people wasn't legally recognized. Children followed the condition of the mother, meaning they were born enslaved, and they could be sold away from their parents at any time.
Just seen as assets to be moved around.
Exactly. Splitting families was a deliberate tactic. It undermined community, solidarity, resistance. It was a tool of control.
And that control was put to the ultimate test in 1739 with the Stono Rebellion.
Right. Stono in South Carolina, maybe 80 to 100 enslaved people rose up, killed some overseers, and tried to march south to Spanish Florida, where they hoped for freedom.
That must have terrified the planters.
It was their absolute worst nightmare realized. And the reaction was swift, brutal, and long-lasting, legally speaking.
Okay, we need to spell this out for the essay. What was the immediate legal consequence? The Negro Act.
The Negro Act of 1740 passed right after Stono. It's like the blueprint for controlling a large enslaved population through fear. It clamped down on everything.
Like what specifically?
Okay, enslaved people were forbidden from growing their own food, which limited independence. They couldn't assemble in groups without white supervision, couldn't earn money, couldn't travel without a pass.
And critically,
It imposed severe penalties for teaching an enslaved person to read or write. Literacy was seen, correctly, as dangerous, as a tool for communication, organization, rebellion.
so that whole package, the intense focus on cash crops, the huge enslaved population, the constant fear, the incredibly restrictive laws like the Negro Act that is the Southern system.
That defines it, yes.
Yeah.
Directly linked to the economics of tobacco and rice.
All right, let's shift gears. Head north. New England, the Middle Atlantic colonies like New York, Pennsylvania. Why didn't large-scale plantation slavery take root there?
Fundamentally, the climate and soil weren't right for those big cash crops. You couldn't profitably grow tobacco or rice or sugar on a massive scale.
So the whole economic basis was different.
Completely different. Northern farms were generally smaller, more diversified wheat, corn, livestock. Labor needs were met differently too. A lot of it came from large families, especially in Puritan New England.
Right, those famously large Puritan families.
Exactly. Plus some indentured servants and hired hands. Investing heavily in enslaved people just didn't offer the same economic return as it did in the South. It wasn't the most profitable model for their economy.
So the concentration of enslaved people was much lower.
Much, much lower. New York had the highest percentage in the North, maybe around 10–14% at its peak, significantly less than Virginia or Carolina. In New England, it was lower still, maybe 2–3%.
So if you were enslaved in the North, what kind of work were you doing? Not plantation agriculture.
No. Slavery in the North was more diffused. It was often more urban or centered around smaller farms or households. You found enslaved people working as artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers.
Skilled labor?
Skilled labor, yes. Also dock workers, sailors on ships out of Boston or New York, workers in shops, and very commonly domestic servants, cooks, maids, personal attendants. Often, an enslaved person might be the only one in that particular household.
Living and working very closely with the white family.
Right, which created a very different dynamic, a different kind of isolation compared to being one of hundreds on a plantation.
That's a key distinction, the type of isolation. How did this northern pattern, this diffusion, affect things like family and culture compared to the South?
Well, it was still bondage, let's be clear. But the conditions allowed for some differences. Because the concentration was low, the fear of mass rebellion wasn't as pervasive among whites as in the South.
Okay, less need for those extreme control measures.
Less systemic need, yes. So the sources suggest enslaved people in the North had a somewhat better chance of having marriages recognized, at least informally, maybe between people enslaved by different families in the same town.
And children. Less likely to be sold away.
Significantly less likely to be just casually sold off, especially when very young. It wasn't the same deliberate policy of family destruction you saw driven by the Southern plantation economy. So there was a chance, albeit fragile, for more family continuity.
What about religion? That seems like a big difference too.
Huge difference. Especially in Puritan New England, religion was central to life. Enslaved people had far more exposure to Christianity, often compulsory exposure, mind you.
Part of the civilizing mission idea.
Exactly, often paternalistic. But that exposure also sometimes provided spaces, like church meetings, where enslaved people could form some semblance of community, which was much harder on isolated Southern plantations.
Okay, this gives us a really strong comparative framework for that essay. Let's try to summarize the core contrasts we've pulled from the sources. 3 main points.
Yeah, I think 3 main points cover it. First, scale and geography. South means massive cash crop plantations demanding rigid, large-scale labor. North means smaller farms, ports, cities, more diversified work, less need for huge concentrations.
How's this? Second.
Second, concentration and control. High concentration in the South leads directly to chattel slavery, extreme laws like the Negro Act, all driven by fear. Low concentration in the North means slavery is more integrated into households or trades, less systemic legal repression on that same scale, though still obviously unfree.
Okay, and third.
Third, family and law. The Southern system actively legally destroyed families as policy. selling children was common practice. In the North, while still enslaved, there was less economic pressure to break up families, so more chance for stable marriages, keeping children, and more exposure to community structures like churches.
Excellent summary. But even with these stark differences, we have to remember that underlying unity. Slavery was, as the sources stress, fundamental to all the colonies. Boston, Charlestown, everywhere in between.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets really interesting. Beyond just the economics, think about what slavery did for white colonists' identity.
How so?
Well, the very idea of English liberty, of being free, having rights, that concept became much sharper, much more meaningful for white people when they could contrast their status against a large population of people who were permanently unfree, owned.
So seeing enslaved black people reinforce their own sense of being free and white.
Precisely. It created a kind of racial solidarity among white colonists, rich and poor. It didn't matter if you were a poor white farmer, you weren't enslaved. Slavery helped define what it meant to be free in English and later American by providing a stark contrast. It was a powerful social and psychological glue.
That's a crucial layer to add. So for your essay, the main argument connects the type of economy, Southern cash crops versus Northern diversity, directly to the type of slavery that developed. The harsh, large-scale, family-destroying system in the South was a direct result of tobacco and rice needs, something the North economy didn't require or support in the same way.
That's the core link. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Think about how deeply embedded slavery became and the whole idea of prosperity in colonial America.
Whether it was massive wealth from a Carolina rice plantation,
Or just the convenience of having an enslaved cook in a New York merchant's house. The success, the functioning, the economic growth of all the colonies was fundamentally tied to the labor of enslaved people. It wasn't peripheral, it was central to the entire colonial project.